Now, let's get straight into things this evening with, as we know, a perfect metaphor for how the world actually works. Now, we know, of course, that this government is all about pretending that they give us stuff or actually doing any of the things they could be doing to help your cost of living. And often, when they come up with something, they turn around and tell us it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, like the decision, of course, to remove $1,500 from 10 million workers. That was last year's budget. And remember, that was to fight inflation. The government needed $1,500 of your money to guarantee that we would be OK with inflation. And today, they're all up and down, of course, as the press gallery declares them the winner in the tax fight debate.
Every Australian, 84% of them will get a higher tax cut under us.
From this Prime Minister, Middle Australia gets a bigger tax cut.
Under this government, with our tax plan, regional Australians will keep more of what they earn.
But to me, there's no better metaphor for how this government is asleep at the wheel on the issue that actually matters than a minister in their own government. Used to be a guest on this program, but now too big for that. Matt Keogh is his name. He is an MP from Perth, but you may well notice that while the sales pitch was on, the Daily Mail claims that, well, they spotted him sleeping, having the quick little naps, assuming that he wouldn't be on television or trying to desperately keep himself awake. So we know they're asleep at the wheel, but now they're literally asleep in the Parliament. I look forward to the angry tweets and denials. But look with your own eyes and tell me whether he was fully into it or not. Now, I do get emails from time to time saying, Paul, why do you always start the show with something about cost of living? Well, the answer is because every poll has told us for as long as this government has been in power, and even before it, the number one issue in the country was cost of living and is cost of living. And the reality is that we've tried to find lots of different ways to tell the story of Australia right now, that Australians are doing it tougher than they have done probably in the best part of a generation, but for some people it's the toughest they've been in their lives. Now, there's lots of ways that we do this, including we try to always show you the data, not just give you the diatribe, not just to give you the blow-up. I want to show you the data. And quite often that comes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, of course, information that comes from things like the census or economic data. But basically it is the official government data, and then many decisions are based off that data. And often that data is completely different than what they actually tell you, which is why we drill down and show you each and every night. It's why we talk about the fact that while the country, thanks to our exports, is not in a recession, we as individuals are living a per capita recession. As Chris Kenny pointed out last night, we are in a three quarters of, there's been three successive quarters of a per capita recession, i.e. the data that says that while the people in charge of things in Canberra might be able to have a number to buff up, the reality of what's happening here in Australia, not great. Some nights we turn around and show you how the government increases taxes that they could choose to stop or reduce if they were really serious about cost of living. Things like the petrol excise that we spoke about on the very day where the rest of the media was talking about potential savings if you bought a new car by 2028. I also know, by the way, we show that one bloke filling petrol almost every night. I do ask for different footage, but that's the one that we always get most nights. However, we also have discussed the endless decisions that happen when it comes to power prices. Now, the government says by next year you'll be down by $275, but the reality is no one believes that's going to happen. I was talking tonight with somebody who owns a pizza shop who was telling me about the literal thousands of dollars that they have to find on top of previous thousands of dollars they had to find to keep their job open. They've also got problems with their NBN at the moment, and they're being told that the NBN won't be fixed in their area till November. As she exacerbated to me over the counter, how hard is it to run a business? Well, we know this government's gone out of its way to make it hard as possible to run a business because the simple political maths is that there are always more workers than there are bosses. And then, of course, we have shown you the reality when it comes to home loans. That despite the fact that the media, generally speaking, talk about things as a little bit more or a little bit less each month, the reality is compared to when interest rates were low before this government, you now have to find an extra $14,500 for a $500,000 loan. Most people have got one around $750,000, so they're having to find an extra $21,000. and so on and so on. We try to find different ways to tell the story, including last night when I held up my very own version of Bundaberg rum. 63% of that bottle is tax. So if the government is truly focused on doing something, the whole point is that I've tried to build a case night after night, week after week, and month after month about all of the different options that they have. But because government is as big as it has ever been, with its fingers in as many things as possible, because remember the modern example of how the Labor Party in places like Victoria and in Queensland have been able to get multiple terms in government beyond their competence is because they want to create a scenario where the majority of Australians are dependent on the government of the day. They want the Labor Party to be indistinguishable from the concept of government of the day. They just want them to be the government. It's why in Queensland they put Queensland government on every possible thing that they fund. And because that government has been Labor for 27 of the past 30 years, people start to put two and two together that there's only one party of government. In Victoria, despite the fact that 33 people died because of the 000 system that fell apart under Daniel Andrews' watch, well, no, the Liberals are evil, they're backwards. So the party of government that's failing to govern is still rewarded because we're able to distract an electorate from the reality of their lives. Now, the Liberal Party in Victoria, not fantastic, but the idea that this one party has been the best part of 30 years of government in Victoria or 30 years of government in Queensland, bar one-term government in each of those states, gives you an idea about how the plan works, which is you want as many public servants as possible, therefore directly want to keep the same government that will always promise more public servants. They want governments that will spend big on projects, which means private business's biggest client is government. Or, as we've shown you before, the welfare budget in this country has expanded now to 36% of the entire federal budget. It's almost double anything else that the Australian government does. So, therefore, they want a scenario where most of the population is dependent on the government for the handout. Now, this is something that Labor has long done. It will attempt to do in this term. If it's pushed into minority government, it will go even further into that when they are being told what to do by the Teals and the Greens. But every now and then, we get some support from the rest of the media that the story I've been telling you, the story that you are living, is actually what's going on. Not the golden spin that comes out of the people who are paid to talk about politics 24/7 and just find it boring to talk about this subject. Instead, it's far more interesting to talk about who won Question Time today than whether what was being talked about in Question Time today means anything to the Australian public. It's a game that has been played for a long period of time, and the more media there is to talk about narrative, the less media there is to actually talk about news. So again, we return to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, who put out a report today that could not be ignored. And even the Sydney Morning Herald turned around and noticed this today, that if you are paying off a mortgage, guess what? You are losing the cost of living war. It was even noticed by a bloke called David Taylor, who tweeted on a personal account, but he works in the economics parts of the ABC. He says, time for some facts. Employee households, working Australians, recorded the largest annual rise in costs, up 6.9% in the year to December 2023 quarter. This is different from the CPI because it measures the interest rate hike budgets, not property prices. And it's not hard to see why. Mortgage interest charges rose 40% annually, plus record increases in insurance costs, which is why I mentioned last night that when the Reserve Bank is talking about the rosiest picture they can possibly put on interest rates, you will still be paying 75% of those numbers that we showed you before when things maybe get slightly better, but they're still bad in 2026. You see, all governments, Liberal and Labor, and inevitably Greens, God help us, they want you to vote against your interests. They want you to constantly support policies that make your life harder, but because they win the politics of the day, they get to keep their power. That's why I have been sceptical of whether an Australian public that I know is pretty damn hard to be fooled, that an Australian public would believe that this government is serious about cost of living when they are putting plenty of taxes up that chew up the taxes that are about to be cut. Remember, for the lowest income workers, it's only going to be about $15 a week that they'll be able to keep of their own money. In many ways, it's a gulf between the numbers that they spin out of Canberra about the economy and the per capita recession, the one where we've been going backwards month after month after month after month after month. But if you believe the politicians and the political class today, the Prime Minister's got a pep in his step and everything's been solved. And yes, the polls have largely passed on that there's no issues when it comes to the tax cuts in terms of whether it's the right thing to do or not. But none of the polls have asked, is it okay to lie? None of the polls have asked, will this change your financial circumstances? Because much of the conversation that's about politics, and I see this as an observer as well as a participant in, is just about the arm wrestle between Team Red and Team Blue, not about how it affects you. It's only if there are bad numbers that come back from you, well, that it reflects on Team Red or Team Blue, and vice versa when it comes to good numbers. Which is why I always try to show you the data, not just the headline. I try to give you the detail, not the diatribe, worth saying twice as we talk about this now. And a lot of people come up to me on the street and they say they appreciate that we give you the data each and every night because you've got a busy life. I understand that you're not there sitting, perching forward, listening and waiting and watching for the latest report to tell us what we already know. So I appreciate your loyalty in coming here to get the data as well as the opinion. We'll have the debate a little bit later. It's about data and debate on this show. Which is why, again, let's go back to this ABS report that came out today, that the Sydney Morning Herald made it clear about workers who were paying off mortgages, and the bloke from the ABC did too. I'm sure he'll be very happy that I pointed out his work. Well, as you can see on this one here, in the selected cost of living indexes that were put out today, the bottom detail that we've circled for you here is the consumer price index, which is just 4%. However, the annual increases in your costs are 6.9%. So see the gulf between the top blue that we've circled in red and the bottom blue that we've circled in red. Well, that's you having to make up the cost of even greater than the spin that comes out of Canberra. Another example about how monies keep going up, and there are taxes associated with all of these things, but it's about insurance. This data here shows us that we are paying more for insurance that, according to this data, well, this data goes back to 2003. And you can see currently for everything from home, boat, car insurance, all of it way up and way up year after year after year. But certainly in the past year, and certainly since the Albanese government took over, you've seen the spike basically go through the roof. About how much more you're paying in insurance. If you're an employee, it's up to 30.5% more on insurance and financial services this year than it was last year. That's way above the rosy best inflation picture in 2 years, right? For pensioners, it's 22%. For age pensioners, it's 18%. And even for self-funded retirees, you would imagine all the discounts kick in, but even then, you're still up 18.1% if you're still insuring your home, your contents, your boat, your car. And in places like regional Australia, where we know that youth crime is particularly out of control, you've got to keep your insurance up. Yet the cost of it keeps going up and up and up and up and up, but your wages don't go up because you don't have wages. You made bets to become a self-funded retiree, or you needed to move on to the pension, and your money remains exactly where it was. Yet the cost of where that money goes, well, it gets sucked up by the day. Which is why I constantly talk about how there is a gulf between what we watch in Canberra each and every day and what you live wherever you happen to be around the country right now. You see, if you believe, again, the political people, the Prime Minister's got the pep in his step and he's got his groove back and he's right back where he was when he was the Morrison destroying machine of 2019 and 2020 and 2021 and the bloke who won in 2022. But the reality is that this is a guy who has come up with a thing that he's able to say is the solution to cost of living. That's what his MPs were being told, the solution to cost of living. But of course, the reality was that if you are one of the people most affected by cost of living, somebody trying to pay off a house or somebody who is a lower income worker, it's not even a bucket to fight the bushfire of inflation, of cost of living. But literally because the arm wrestle between Team Red and Team Blue is being won slightly today by one side over the other, then somehow people think that that's how you are taking it in the real world. Well, I would disagree. For their part, the opposition was trying to deliver the picture of the real world to bust the BS bubble in Canberra today.
Under this government, Australians are paying on average $8,000 a year in additional costs. People with a mortgage are paying $24,000 a year. They're worse off. Energy costs are up by $1,000 and food prices are up nearly 10%, Prime Minister.
Before the election, the Prime Minister promised a $275 reduction in energy prices. No changes to super taxes, no changes to franking credits, cheaper mortgages and no changes to bipartisan tax policy. The Prime Minister has broken every one of these promises.
Now, obviously, a federal election is longest case scenario in the first part of 2025. The earliest it can possibly happen is in August of this year, which is why the tax cuts, well, as small as they are, they come in on the 1st of July. My suggestion, my bet, my inclination, me waters if you will, is that the $1,500 they took off you last year, they'll give back to you this year. And if there is the chance of an interest rate fall, even ever so slightly, despite the fact that the best case scenario by 2026 is you're still paying 75% of what you're paying right now, which of course is way higher than it was before they became the government, that Australia will fall to its knees and thank a wonderful government for doing its bit, despite the fact that, as I've shown you, how many levers they don't pull. But it is going to be really fascinating to see whether the spin that comes out of the political media complex is enough to actually get people to overlook their own circumstances, to reward a government that took money off you last year, increased taxes on you this year, and best case scenario for low-income earners is giving you $15 a week back. It's that Dunkley by-election. Now, the margin is 6%. Meaning there'd have to be a pretty significant number of people that are going to change their mind this year compared to 2 years ago. But what's fascinating here is that, as I've pointed out, to people who are paying off a mortgage, they are having real problems at the moment when it comes to cost of living. Well, of the 59,000 houses or units or townhouses that are in the Dunkley electorate, I can tell you that 41% are in the exact red zone that we've been talking about tonight. Working people paying off a mortgage. Now, this is 6.6% higher than the national average, meaning the people whose interest rates have gone all the way up under this government, and even if the RBA is right, come slightly back to 75% of where they are now, who are paying more for petrol, more for booze, and all of the other excises that the government puts in place, whether they will reward the Prime Minister for giving them back just a small amount per week. And also what's worth noting here is that the mean income in Dunkley is $42,588. That means the potential tax cut for that person is just $14 a week. We will see whether they reward Labor for the spin that they are trying to help rather than the reality that what help they are offering is not enough. And all of the levers that they have to pull, they are not pulling. Instead, they are just involved in the arm wrestle to amuse the people in the media sitting up and watching Question Time. The people in the media who have shown that even when this week petrol taxes went up, they reported on spin about new cars that if you buy them may save you $1,000 in petrol in 2028. Literally a story 4 years down the road for this many people versus a tax increase on every single driver. That's because, of course, they're interested, they're invested in the resuscitation of the Prime Minister because they either ideologically prefer this government or for access reasons, they prefer their proximity to power that comes out of this government, which is why they cover the narrative, not the news. They do the headline and the spin, not the data, because the data is relentless. That Australians have been in trouble for some time. It gets worse, and even if it got better, when it comes to interest rates, it'll still be 3/4 of what you are currently paying now in 2026 and beyond.